Now, today I would like to share a story with you about just quite a digression that I went into as I was researching my grandfather's story, and I've called this episode A Random Russian, The Strange Tale of Alexander Walstone Puttning. As you may recall from a previous episode, I talked about how I had been trying to research the circumstances of when my grandfather was wounded by looking at the New Zealand casualty lists. And as you can see, is a slide I've used before showing the record of my grandfather's wound. And that led me to look up 39 other military files of men who were also machine gunners who were wounded around about the same time. And most of the files were pretty standard and uninformative, but I found a few that were rather interesting. And the one I'm going to talk about today was positively bizarre. When I pulled the military file of Alexander Walstone Puttning, I could immediately tell there was something strange going on. I've been looking at a lot of these, and I'm pretty used to going straight to the necessary information. And immediately I found there was something odd. So let's start with just his occupation and the other things. Okay, nothing too strange. A molder and pattern maker from the Union Steamship Company. Under his religion, you'll notice that often, in addition to which church he belongs to, in this case, Church of England, there'll often be where he's from. And Riga, Russia, doesn't normally correspond with an Anglican. And then last New Zealand address, the steamship Wairuna, Union Steamship Company. So what, he lived on a ship? Okay. And then he's pretty old when he signs up for war. So he's 40 years old. But again, by this stage in the war, they're getting desperate to meet recruiting targets. So, okay, they'll take older men if they can get them. And elsewhere in the file, the reason, in fact, I was looking at his file at all was because he had suffered a GSW, a gunshot wound in the back and right buttock on the 12th of October. So a few days after Grandad. So not very helpful in telling me anything about Grandad's battle and wound. But, well, that's why I happened to look him up. But then I looked at another section of his file, and it said that his birthday was on the 18th of November, 1871. There's a 5-year discrepancy between the age. And the other reason that's troubling is that he's too old. He's 45. They would not have been taking 45-year-olds at this point. Okay, what else was there that was odd? Well, under the next of kin, Mr. Hankerson, no first name, a friend, not a next of kin, just a friend from Australia. Okay, and even stranger, the second next of kin, the manager, who's a friend. Silverstream Brickworks, Silverstream near Upper Hutt, Wellington. Okay, he doesn't even know the guy's name, and he describes him as a friend. Uh, Odd. And then elsewhere, when he has to name next of kin, he's got this guy J. Peg, friend, Trentham Military Camp. Now, Trentham was the main army base where the troops would gather before being sent off to war. So his next of kin records are odd. What else was there? Well, we've got his vital statistics in the form. So he's 5 foot tall, he's 166 pounds, he's got a dark complexion, blue eyes, okay, and he's 5'4". Elsewhere in the file, it says he's 5'7". Um, the same weight, but completely different height. And still elsewhere in his military file, it says he's 5'6". And this part at least tells us blue eyes, black hair, but again repeats that he's Anglican. Normally you don't get mistakes like this, not regular repeated mistakes. But there was more making me scratch my head. So here is his attestation paper. And let's look at some of the answers to the questions he was asked. So, where were you born? Okay, Riga, Russia. We've learned that already. Are you a British subject? Yes. Okay, that's not impossible, but odd. Father's name, John Puttning. Mother's name, Anne Puttning. Now, Riga is today in Latvia, and whether you're talking about Russian name or Latvian names, John Puttning and Anne Puttning, forget about Alexander Walstone Puttning, don't exactly sound like Russian or Latvian names. Where were the parents born? Both in Russia. And how long have you been in New Zealand? 2 days. So when did he become a British subject exactly? What was your last address? Again, same detail, steamship Wairuna. Have you ever served in any military force? 9 years in the Russian army, left Russia. Okay, what exactly is going on with this New Zealand machine gunner? Now, again, I said it verbally. I just want to repeat this before somebody jumps down my throat. I know that Riga is in Latvia. I've even been there. It was stunningly beautiful, and I thoroughly enjoyed my time in Latvia. I know Latvia is not part of Russia today, but during World War One, it was indeed part of the Russian Empire, and so the forms are going to call him Russian. He's part of the Russian Empire during World War One. There it is, Riga. Okay, other interesting details about this fellow. Tattoo on chest and both forearms. Okay, well, I guess if he was a sailor, you kind of expect tattoos. And then I had quite a lot of difficulty reading this, and what I think it says doesn't entirely make sense, but this is what I got. Is wanting left testicle removed 11 years ago when rupture was cured. Now, maybe you can read that cursive better than I can, but it certainly seems to say he's only got one ball, but he's rated as fit to join the army. Now, I'm puzzling over this, and then I come back and I study this little bit of pencil writing that's right at the top of the form that I'd neglected because usually you don't find any interesting information there. And I just kind of skipped it over. It was hard to read. It was in pencil and wasn't sure what it was. So I'd just gone through looking at the normal things. But as I started to puzzle more and more about this file, I came back and decided I better decipher it. And this is what I got. Allowed to land in New Zealand on condition he enlisted. Stowaway, only found after leaving from Wellington. And that seemed to largely solve the mystery. Well, not solve the mystery, but at least give a serious clue as to who was this person and why his answers were so strange. And I tried to unravel where had the Wairuna been before it came to New Zealand, and I found this little report from the Otago Witness, May 1917, a fruit report, a shipment of Suva bananas, about 900 cases arrived ex the Wairuna, sailing direct for Dunedin. The shipment was landed in excellent condition and, you know, got a good price. So Suva is in Fiji, so that at least gives us one step away from New Zealand. So he's a stowaway or he's working aboard the Wairuna. He had come to New Zealand via Fiji. Where was he before Fiji, and how do you backtrack his story all the way to Russia and Latvia? I do not know. And I managed to find a photo of the Wairuna. There it is. And it turns out that he chose exactly the right time to get off the Wairuna, because if he had stayed on it for its next voyage, it went from New Zealand up, well, it was trying to go to San Francisco, and it never arrived, and initially it was rather a mystery, and then it came out that a German commerce raider was in the Pacific called the Wolf, and the Wolf had intercepted and sunk the Wairuna. So it was a good time to leave that ship behind. Now, what else can I learn about him? He only had one report on his conduct sheet for getting in trouble. That was during January of 1918 when he was in England. And it was disobedience of orders in that he was in a wet canteen AIF camp Bulford. AIF is the Australian Imperial Force, the Australian equivalent of the New Zealand Expeditionary Force. And a wet canteen, of course, is where you can go and get a drink. And for that, he forfeited 2 days' pay. So I would rate that as a minimally serious infraction. And that's it. That's the only time he got in trouble. And what else can I learn about him? Well, marched into Camp Camiers. You'll see on my grandfather's form an exact match to this copy. It's the main machine gun depot in France. So after he had been trained in England to use heavy machine guns, he was then sent across to France. And on June the 8th, 1918, he was assigned to D Company. It doesn't actually say it there, but elsewhere on the form it says it was D Company. That was my grandfather's company. So this interesting fellow joins my grandfather's company. There would have only been 100 odd men in the company during in the machine gunners. So surely my grandfather must have seen him. And they happened to be at Bois de Warnemont in France at the time. Oh, and one other thing to note when you're reading these military forms, you'll frequently see this strange word do, but it's not do, it's an abbreviation for ditto. In fact, so it means the same as above. So the earlier location was in the field, so the DO underneath it, ditto, also in the field. And there's a map showing you where this location is, and you'll see it's quite close to a lot of place names that are very famous if you're familiar with the history of World War One. There's Albert, Peronne, Cambrai, Amiens, Arras. I mean, all of these feature heavily in any story of the fighting in the trenches in World War One. And quite interestingly, when the New Zealand Prime Minister visited the machine gunners later the same month, they were still in the same location. So if you look in that photo of New Zealand Prime Minister Massey addressing the machine gunners, well, I've often wondered if my grandfather's in that photo somewhere. I've studied the faces really hard and can't find them. But that also means there's a good chance that our fellow Alexander is somewhere in there as well. Now, what else could I learn about these reinforcements? Well, I did find a record in the monthly battalion records, and this is what the lieutenant colonel in charge of the machine gunners had to say. These reinforcements consisted mainly of men who had previous service in the field with the machine gun corps. A small percentage of men had not been on active service before. Well, that certainly would have been Puttning. Each draft was medically examined on its arrival, and generally speaking, the health of the men was good. In some cases, inability to carry a pack was noticeable, and there seems to be an increasing number of men not physically fitted for the heavier duties of machine gunners. When it is remembered that the average machine gunner had to carry at least 40 pounds more than the average infantryman, the want of physically perfect men becomes evident. Reinforcements for this period have been satisfactory. So he didn't have any noticeable complaints, but I can't help wondering if this 40 or possibly 45-year-old Russian fellow may have caused him some questions. And there's another reason why he might have had some questions about this fellow. Again, from the battalion routine orders from May, the month before Puttning arrived. And here's what it had to say. Soldiers, Russian. Information has been received that there are many soldiers of Russian extraction in the British Army whose loyalty is doubted. Company commanders will report on any of their men whose loyalty is doubted, and steps will be taken to have them detached to base. Now, Puttning was never detached to base, so I assume, therefore, that, well, nobody questioned his loyalty. He was never kicked out for any reason like that. Now, why on earth would there be something like this in the battalion orders for the May of 1918? Well, I don't know. Perhaps something was going on in Russia that would cause the British Army to question the potential loyalty of Russian troops in their ranks. I don't know. I've got nothing. And how about the company, my grandfather's company, D Company, when this strange fellow turned up? Well, this is pure imagination, but the photos are a real photo of some New Zealand machine gunners. But here's how I imagine it going down. So, you're one of the new boys from Maoriland, are you? Da. You don't sound much like a Kiwi. You're sure you're from New Zealand? Da. You're not pulling our legs. Net. Yeah, yeah. All right, whatever. And well, there's really nothing to report. He joins in June and he stays with them in June, and there's nothing recorded for his time with them. And then on October the 12th, 4 days after my grandfather's shot through the face, he suffers a GSW, gunshot wound, to the back and right buttock. And then he's evacuated to the CCS, the Casualty Clearing Station, and from there back to England where he's in hospital. And eventually, in December of 1918, he will board a ship, the steamship Oxfordshire, and head back to New Zealand. And once he gets to New Zealand, on the 2nd of March 1919, he is discharged from the New Zealand Army. There was only one further record in New Zealand that I could find concerning this interesting guy, and it comes from a New Zealand Police Gazette in February of 1922, and here is what it reads. 29th December 1921, from the person of Alexander Walstone Puttning, engineer, Tikawiti, while under the influence of liquor, a gentleman's gold hunting Amiga watch, a gold double watch chain, and £11 in notes and silver. Total value £39. Identifiable except money. So he got drunk and someone stole his watch and some cash. And he was in Tikawiti. Now, Tikawiti is not exactly a large metropolis in New Zealand. You can see it's, I don't know, what would that be, about an hour and a half's drive south of Hamilton. And frankly, in New Zealand, it's only really known for one thing, and I think their claim to fame is sheep shearing. That's about it. So somehow or other, after he got back to New Zealand, he ended up working in Tikawiti. And then the only other detail I have of his life is where he died. He died in Brisbane, Australia in July of 1936 of pneumonia and cardiac failure. And he was buried in Toowong, Brisbane. And I actually managed to find a record of his gravesite. And and that actually noted, I was rather pleased to see, that there had been a funeral notice in an Australian newspaper, the Courier Mail from Brisbane in 1936, and it said the funeral of the late Alexander Puttning, late New Zealand Expeditionary Forces, will leave the funeral parlour, 45 Adelaide Street, City, this Thursday afternoon at 2 o'clock for the Toowong Cemetery. And I wanted to see what else I could learn, so I looked up the Toowong Cemetery. It's actually a pretty major cemetery. You can't be buried there anymore because it's completely full. The only people who are allowed to be buried there are people who have family plots who want to be buried in an existing gravesite to, go with the rest of their family. And there's at least one Australian Prime Minister buried there. There's quite a number of Australian premiers. Peter Jackson is buried there. Nope, not that Peter Jackson. He was a heavyweight boxing champion, and a few other famous people. And I even managed to track down exactly where the gravesite would be of Puttning. And it's just beside the Cannon Garland place on this map. That's the number 3. And Cannon Garland is actually called in Australia the father of Anzac Day. The New Zealanders had a different process for commemorating it, but Garland was particularly associated with getting the very first Anzac Day ceremonies and commemorations kick-started in Australia. And as I researched the cemetery a little bit more, I found out that portion 10, that whole chunk of the cemetery, was reserved for return services. Return services being a term used for the vets, the veterans. So he was buried in that section 72. And again, I got a Google satellite map and found, roughly speaking, at least the general area where he must have been buried. So who was Alexander Walstone Puttning? Well, first off, I think that Alexander may well have been his real name. The Latvian equivalent of Alexander is, well, that. I'm not going to try to pronounce it because I don't speak Latvian and I do not know how a Latvian would pronounce that name, but it's the local equivalent of the name Alexander. How did he end up with the middle name Walstone? I have nothing. I looked for any Latvian or Russian names that even sounded vaguely like Walstone. Honestly, the closest I got was Vasily, and that doesn't sound anything like Walstone. And there is, however, a family name that's not uncommon in Estonia and Latvia that does look a fair bit like Puttning. So I can just imagine, here's my scenario. This guy's been caught as a stowaway aboard this ship. He's been told he'll be allowed to get out for New Zealand as long as he signs up for the New Zealand Army. He presents himself to the enlistment officer, who is told, sign him up. The enlistment officer has a problem because he's too old and he's not a British citizen, but he's got to sign him up anyway. So he just goes, British citizen, yep. And then he asks him what his name is, and I can just imagine him saying something like, Alexander Puttning. And the guy going, I'm just going to write down Alexander Walstone Puttning. Mother's name, something, something, something he doesn't understand. I'm just going to write, is it John? Mother's name. I just write Anne. Something like that. He has no clue what's going on. So he's just lying, recording random information. How tall are you? The guy shrugs his shoulders, so he just eyeballs him and thinks, oh, you might be about 5'7" or 5'4". That might also explain why the height is not exactly accurate. And not much else to say, really. My guess is he was a Russian army deserter who wanted to get as far away from Russia as he possibly could. I mean, he'd had 9 years in the Russian army, and goodness knows, by 1916, 1917, the Russian army was not a good place to be in World War One. And, well, all we can say to wrap it up is that he did serve with the New Zealanders in France. And when he died in Australia, he was given a place among the Anzac veterans at the grave in Brisbane. And frankly, that's all I know about Alexander Walstone Puttning.